Thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm joined by Simon Pont, author and commentator and brand builder.
All three.
Triple threat, okay. We've got Richard Pattinson, head of BBC StoryWorks. We've got James Morris of MediaCom. And we've got, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, Nick Chiarelli? All right. Nick Chiarelli, key account man at the Future Foundation. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. So I have an entire question set here that I'm going to pretty much throw out the window right now. As managing director at Digiday, where we focus on the digital media and marketing industry, a lot of my own clients are very technology focused, so I can get very wonky into KPIs and stuff like that. But before I do, I'm interested, Nick, to hear a little bit about what you thought was the most interesting part of the research, since your focus really is exclusively on the consumer.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. I thought, obviously, we agree fundamentally with the notion of emotional engagement being a key attribute that brands should be aspiring to in their discussions with consumers nowadays. Partly because we live in a world where consumers are bombarded with messaging. They're busy, they're stressed. They're also increasingly cynical and savvy about the marketing process. So traditional marketing, traditional advertising, we know that they can either avoid it through clicking away, or even if they don't avoid it, they just don't engage with it. So we fundamentally agree with the notion that brands now have to engage with a higher level kind of conversation. And a lot of that is around providing content, not just traditional advertising that shouts about the merits of product X or Y, but is something that gives consumers something they can find informative or provocative or just downright entertaining. And I thought the interesting notion about shareability was a fantastic one, because that's something we wholeheartedly subscribe to, that shareability is what drives a lot of consumer engagement with content and with activities, with leisure activities, with all kinds of purchase choices. Is not just how much am I going to enjoy this, but how shareable is it, and what are people going to think of me when I do share it, in the sense of building social capital. So there's tons of stuff in there, but that's some of my early takes, is that emotional engagement and building higher level kind of relationships between brands and consumers, where the consumers look to certain brands to provide interesting stories and content, as well as supply products and services, is really going to be increasingly common as we go forward. Right.
So I think one thing that strikes me about branded content, and I think this is also sort of part of where the issue is that it's a coming together of this sort of very high level romantic notion of telling powerful stories, right? But then it's so often rooted in digital media that we're also beholden to KPIs like click-through and eCPMs and stuff like that. And so it's very hard now to come to a middle ground of something that combines something that is both intuitively valuable, but also provides something that's valuable to the marketers themselves that they can act on. You're in the agency world, James. How are you guys marrying these?
Well, actually, before I answer that, one thing that I was very relieved about at Andrew's comment was that he thinks there's a big future in content marketing. So I've been doing it for the last 5 years, and I hope to be doing it for the next 5 years as well. So that's a big relief. But in terms of this, well, I think that your point is really interesting. I think what Nick said earlier is the challenge to advertising right now is we've kind of known for many years that emotive advertising works, whether we go back to the Guinness horse ads, through to flash mobs at Liverpool Street Station, through to the recent epic Christmas ads. So we've kind of known that emotive advertising works, so we're kind of not learning that much from that part of the study, I don't think. But what is really interesting for me here is how do we blend this art and science? Actually, how does the advertising and the community embrace the learnings that are here? And I think what is really interesting about this is that, firstly, this study wasn't just done on video. Most of the work that we've done in this space has been focused purely on video. But it's actually looking at your point about how do we target consumers in the future? Are we looking to entertain them? Are we looking to programmatically target them and look at their user behaviors on all these different channels? And I think what the challenge to advertisers is moving forward is how do we pull back and actually look at the marketing objectives that we're trying to achieve in any campaign that we do, and then look at how do we target those consumers where they are? Because I think one of the important lessons of this is that this is talking very much about a digital and mobile world. And I think what we need to learn as a community in advertising is how do we be native, how do we create content that is native to the environments where those consumers are. And I think the big lessons here is how do you format that sort of content, because you can't take the same creative rules as a 30-second spot or a print ad into digital, into mobile, into Instagram, into all these different platforms. And for me, the big learning around this is actually, if we get that emotive storytelling right, we also need to understand the format where we're distributing this content. And that, I think that is what engenders the shareability and the, that we're all seeking for, I guess.
Right. And that's where, you know, in-house studios like StoryWorks come in, is sort of bringing that native know-how to bear for advertisers. What did you find to be the most useful part of the study, Richard?
Well, there's so much in it, and there's obviously more detail than we were able to sort of go in the presentation this morning. But I just think that it was very striking, the difference in the kind of engagement between those that were given it with the brand transparency and those that were given it without the brand transparency. And I think that, you know, at a time for the industry, at a time where, you know, there's been some rulings around whether or not native advertising has been correctly labelled and those sort of questions, the fact that actually you can have a conversation where you can demonstrate that there's a genuine positive value to that clear labelling, not just, you know, for audiences, but actually for brands and for how you know, for the positive impact that audiences therefore have on that brand. I thought that was really interesting. And then the other fascinating bit of the study was obviously this idea that if you integrate, you know, as part of the content in a way that makes sense to the audience, you've got the brand voice within the content, then that's even more powerful too. Because again, I don't think that that's something that's necessarily been widely understood or appreciated. So it's the sense that sometimes there's been a feeling that in some of the discussion that native advertising is somehow surreptitious advertising. Well, actually, this says that doesn't work as well. Audiences really like this kind of content, but they want to know what it is, and they want to be clear about what they're getting.
Right. And the brand voice part of it is interesting, integrating the brand, because I think some people might think that to be counterintuitive, although I'm sure advertisers, that's music to their ears. In terms of how it's integrated, though, I mean, one of the things that we said already is that it has to be editorially appropriate. What does that mean? When is it appropriate to bring your advertiser into the story like that?
Well, I think from the conversations that we have, I mean, we did one of the case studies was an HSBC piece that we did as part of a series of content that we did for them in 2015. It was actually our most successful native series in 2015, and what we were able to do with that series, which is on people, sort of expats thinking about living abroad, was have a conversation with HSBC about the data that they had, about the the interesting things that we could talk to our community on BBC Capital, 61% of whom are currently expats, which is an extraordinary number. So you've got this audience that's, you know, naturally going to be interested in this content. You've got a brand that's got a real value to add there. And so it's the combination of those things that we feel most comfortable with editorially, in which, you know, we've got demonstration from some of the older style metrics, you know, the dwell time, the page views, that this was our standout native series in 2015. So, you know, we don't want to throw out all the old analytics when we're talking about sort of facial coding. Actually, you know, the data is there as well. So for us, it's being able to use this to, again, with the HSBC study, some of the that we didn't have a chance to see today, some of the emotional responses in the piece that we looked at were about how you carry on long-term relationships when you're living abroad, you know, the jeopardy involved with people who are moving around and what that does to their family and their direct relationships. And so the sort of the heightened emotions were fear and sadness. Because that's what you would expect from an emotional perspective if you are empathising with the characters in that piece of content. But again, if you look at the sort of the control piece where the HSBC branding isn't apparent versus the one where it is, there's a huge uplift in that emotional attachment. So just extraordinary, just evidence to sort of support what one might intuitively suspect, but you know, sort of seeing it in action is really interesting.
The HSBC example is a good exemplar, the right one that's appropriately branded, of content marketing done right. effectively, because really the very simple distinction between content marketing and advertising is that of either a brand trying to sell you something versus a brand having something to say. And content marketing lives in the space of a brand that has something to say as opposed to very overtly having something to sell. And if it sells a lot stronger by selling a lot less and saying the right kind of things in the right kind of way, back to the tenets of storytelling.
Yeah.
Just on that HSBC having something to say, actually one of the KPIs they wanted from the campaign was specifically about their Expat Explorer survey and sort of direct engagement with the bank in terms of the sort of content they create themselves, and that was a massively successful part of the campaign as well. So as part of being part of a conversation in a way that the audience understood, actually it really did deliver in terms of the KPIs they were setting for the campaign as well.
One thing I really found interesting about that campaign was the idea that it did bring forward ideas, it did bring forward the feelings of fear and sadness, and those feelings were effective. And I think, particularly from the point of view of a publisher storyteller or storytellers who are willing to take a little bit more risk, that might be a little counterintuitive to brands that are used to doing traditional advertising, which is very much about making people feel good and therefore want to purchase. James, is that a guardrail for your clients? Is that something you're trying to break through with?
It varies hugely. I mean, we've got some clients on our roster like Coca-Cola who've actually been content marketeers, I think, for the last 30 years. So we don't really have much to teach them around that space. They've been investing in sport and music for many years, and if you see a great piece of content around Christmas time, you kind of expect it to be from Coca-Cola. I think, everybody knows and talks about the Red Bull examples, how they've turned kind of advertising on its head and actually just become a publisher in their own right. They've decided we're not going to work with agencies and commission advertising. We're just going to create extreme sport content because that sells our brand better than anything else. And I think that works for them. But I don't think every brand can move to that model, can be the Red Bull. They've obviously got a product which is about energy and it can tell those sort of stories. Others of our brands are much more corporate, have a much more less emotive product. And I think really what we're talking about is I hate the word, I really hate the word, and it gets banned around, but this authenticity thing about actually if a brand is going to tell a story and it is going to say something credible in that space, it kind of has to speak to some extent to the product and what the brand stands for. And I think without that connection, I think that's when you get puzzlement from consumers in that sort of study, because they're looking, why on earth is that brand trying to say and do that sort of thing.
But it's an exciting idea, though, isn't it, that a brand doesn't just have to associate or create content that has natural feel good. Yeah. That the message is it has to feel something, but actually feel scared, feel frightened, feel anything that is provocative can still be very positive, because it's the brand that's facilitated a piece of content that's had a strong emotional response that as a consequence can drive its favourability scores by at least being authentic and legitimate in the editorial themes that it's addressing.
I mean, this is not something that's just true of content marketing. Traditional advertising is going down the same pathway. If you think about the John Lewis ad we talk about, that was deliberately designed to stir up uncomfortable feelings of loneliness and isolation, etc. The McDonald's campaigns of last year were designed to debunk myths around specifics of food production, where your chicken nuggets came from, etc. So people are, tackling difficult issues head on and saying, we know that people are having these kind of conversations or thoughts in a negative sense about our brand. So either we're going to advertise specifically in a much more mature and grown up and realistic way and tackle those kind of things head on. And the same, I think, is true of content marketing too. I think
one of the things of this study is how savvy consumers, how savvy audiences are. And actually, if you are a brand that has either has a perception which means that you do need to confront some issues which do engender those kind of emotions, and that's a conversation where you should step up to the plate and have that conversation, and audiences will respect you for it.
But that's at the core of great journalism as well. In particularly, we're talking about the evaluation of printed word or written word here. But the essence of great journalism is the balance of debate and showing both sides of an argument, but ultimately something that takes the reader on a rewarding, provocative, discursive journey around a theme or an idea that therefore is satisfying and compels and captivates, that at the end they feel that they've found something out that they didn't have before. And if the brand has caused that or prompted that or created that, then that's all good. So I think it's back to feel something's better than feel nothing at all, because feel nothing's a total failure for a content marketing brief.
Our consumer research absolutely suggests that consumers are much more ready for this nuanced conversation. They know, they're tired of just brand trumpet blowing and saying how wonderful. Brands that either don't take themselves too seriously, a bit of sort of self-satirizing, a bit of self-deprecation, or that's something that recognises that there are pros and cons to one's particular product category or even one's own products, is a far more mature and real. It's the kind of conversation people have about things in the pub, is recognising pros and cons around things. So we're seeing consumers, wanting a far more sort of mature and genuine kind of conversation between themselves and brands, rather than the traditional kind of one-sided, only positive kind of story.
So that's actually a good jumping off point for where this all is heading, because if consumers are ready for this nuanced conversation, where do we go from here? Traditional advertising isn't going away anytime soon, but there has been a rise in ad blocking, so banner ads are a bit, their future is a bit suspect. Is content marketing a very strong direction to go in right now? And I think the answer, all signs point to yes. Right? Yeah, but how do we evolve this now? We're telling great stories. They have to mesh with the marketing brief. They have to move sentiment for advertisers. But what's the next step in this?
From my perspective, there's an argument to be made that the future of advertising is content, and actually is the real distinction between the two. Obviously we're seeing lots of consumer trends now around subscription models for media and for content. So whether that's for your music or for your filmed content. And I think, obviously, in those environments, you pay a premium to not receive advertising. And as you said, the phenomenon of ad blocking is for me, has been a part response for just how poor advertising has been in actually trying to speak and talk to consumers. Plonking sterile banner ads that actually don't follow a previous user journey, showing me a shirt that I looked at 3 weeks ago that I might have already even bought, but continue to show me that over the following 3 weeks is a pretty poor way to advertise. So I think that the future for me, it comes back to actually the first comment you made, Deanna, is the job of advertising really is to do two things. One is to deliver big entertaining content. To actually, the most successful brands are usually the ones that actually are able to create those sort of big iconic pieces. But increasingly in the world that we're entering into, this sort of very multi-platform, mobile-driven world, we're on lots of different channels now. So we've got to be much smarter at how we target and speak to those consumers in those environments, which isn't telling beautiful 30-minute films or 3-minute ads. That's going to be much more of a targeted message, which could be a GIF, could be an image, could be some copy that actually speaks to that consumer more in a one-to-one native way.
I actually have a question on that, because in our conversation yesterday, you mentioned that in, I forget, it was like 1991, the consumer attention span was 9 minutes. I find that incomprehensible, and I was there in 1991. In video, and now it's much, much shorter.
It's about 9 seconds.
But you think of things like a Facebook feed, an Instagram feed, where people are just flicking through this stuff, and we're getting away from the idea of native, and perhaps in the way that BBC is doing it for this study. But what is the value of content like that versus the one you sit down with?
I mean, it's our user, as you said, it's now our user behaviours. I think the big revolution of the internet is about the impact of technology on how we consume content. And I think, obviously there's a difference between sitting and watching TV to kind of digital environments. But the one learning that we got from the study, which was focused much more on video, was that if you don't deliver an immediate hook in the first 5 seconds of content you create, the user is gone. So you might have the most amazing 3-minute film or 4 or 5, but if you haven't hooked their attention in that first 5 or so seconds, they've flicked onto something else. So it actually starts to give us some new creative rules really for the formats that we need to create moving forward. It doesn't. It's that, as I said earlier, it's that blend between art and science, and so I don't think I can't foresee there's ever going to be an algorithmic style of creative, but I think what it does give us is some rules for formats of how we create advertising and content in the future.
But the welcome rather than terrifying message in that, of course, is that while there's maybe a 9-second norm, you can break that 9-second norm if you are firstly cognizant to it and then do something remarkably strong with the work, with the creative, and it still gets back to this. And it's the first word that that repopped from the presentations. This one about transactions, and I think almost content deserves almost this invisible prefix, transactional content, because if we don't lose sight of the fact that there is this value exchange, this content, this message potentially facilitated by an advertiser, potentially by a broadcaster, a film studio, a publisher, it's asking for something of people's time and attention. Yeah. And that's a big ask. But if the return is greater than the ask, then they'll spend a lot more than 9 seconds. They may even spend 9 minutes still with 20-year throwback. And so the very notion of content as a transactional quid pro quo, in response to someone's time, in order to therefore reward them with something, and therefore what's at the heart of content. And this is back to the, your question at the beginning about intuitive versus accountable. Intuition, and indeed welcome studies like this, send a very clear message that really content must be, essentially one of two things, or ideally both. It must entertain or it must inform. And if it entertains and or informs and educates, to some point about your HSBC work, then it's strong work. And people won't mind whether that's by a broadcaster, by a film studio, or from a brand. In fact, they'll welcome it from wherever.
Exactly.
In terms of consumer reception, is there a generational difference as to how people are perceiving this stuff?
Absolutely, there is. I mean,
how would we know?
yeah, exactly. Ask my daughter. No, but actually, there is. I mean, I'll come to that in a second. I wanted to just quickly answer the previous question about where this stuff is going, just with a point of view from the consumer, which is, and I think, arguably, we're entering a stage when the very definition of what advertising is going to have to be redefined, and arguably, I think content-led marketing is probably the flag bearer for where it's going to go, in the sense that. And it all comes down to targeting and the fact that people can easily ad block or avoid. So I think we're going to see this massive sort of schism in how people regard content of any type, whether it's advertising or content-led marketing or whatever, is am I interested in it or am I not? And the challenge for anyone throwing content at people is knowing which side of that divide someone is on. So that if you're throwing me content on washing powder, no thank. But if it's golf clubs, then I don't regard it as advertising. I regard it as content, and I think that's the massive. And so, in terms of to bring it back to your question about generational differences, that's where we're going to see the most profound differences is just in the willingness with which people give permission for those kind of approaches to be made. We find young people far more receptive to how many people just page through the T&Cs without even looking and blindly give away permission for. So we're seeing that kind of schism there. I
think the lesson in that, Nick, for advertisers is that we've got to be smart about this because as I said, not every brand needs to be a Red Bull, and that wouldn't be the smart move for all brands at all. But we need to use big emotive advertising if we want to drive big awareness and we want this big propensity and loyalty to your brand in the long term. But if you're a brand where people are searching for your product and all they want is what you need to give them is some information about that, there's no point in creating some epic 30-minute emotive film to actually target. If all your sales are for 50,000 units and you've got 200,000 people on Google searching for your product, then you just need to create some informative content, highly optimized, that actually reaches them, and there's going to be much more propensity for them to purchase on the basis. So I think it's not a one-size-fits-all. We've got to be smart strategically about how we do this on behalf of advertisers too.
And one of the challenges for publishers in those conversations with brands and their partners is just thinking about how the storytelling evolves. We're talking about the different environments, how you tell stories with people on mobile devices. My background before heading up StoryWorks was as a journalist and commissioning editor at BBC News, and one of the journeys that we went on as an organisation was from thinking about what video content looked like in the digital space. And I think that very early on there was a feeling that you could just take a package from the 6 o'clock or the 10 o'clock news and chop off the bit where the reporter was introducing it, bung it online, and you've still got a reporter doing a piece to camera, sort of go on stick and traditional package put together. And that's not how people wanted. We quickly discovered, or maybe not as quickly as we should have done, but pretty quickly discovered that that's not how people wanted to consume video content online. You need to think about how you tell stories, the kind of intimacy of the screen that you're watching the content on compared to watching it on a big screen at the other end of the room. And then, of course, you know, sort of what sort of length that should be, how that works in the social space. We did a series of a series with Cathay Pacific at the end of last year on the theme of Life Well Travelled, which is their sort of their brand theme, and we did a couple of really lovely videos. One of them was travel bloggers talking about what Life Well Travelled meant to them, and that did we posted that on our StoryWorks Facebook page, and that did incredibly well. I think we got sort of 800,000 or 900,000 video views as per Facebook, and that means, you know, 1 second somewhere on the screen, but actually around 150,000 who watched it for at least 30 seconds. So really, really high level of engagement around that content. So if you're creating the right kind of content, putting it in place that people want to consume it, and you know, you can make it work.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point about talk about the location and the situation in which people consume content is a massive determinant of how content should look and feel and be to use. We've got a trend we talk about called smart boredom, which is basically just this, you know, you've got 2 minutes waiting for the train. What first thing we do, everyone does it, where's my phone? And you just engage with pieces of content. We've seen some really nice examples. For example, I forget an agency who's packaged up, they've got an app which basically talks directly to the time boards that tell you how long the bus is going to take to come. Right. And we'll talk directly to that and then serve up people YouTube clips that will last exactly the duration of their wait time, for example. That's just some nice fun stuff. But thinking about sort of portioning content and also how seamlessly content can be picked up again if people's viewing of it or reading of it gets interrupted, or flagging up right at the beginning of how long content's going to take, not just in video, which is commonplace, but if you think of some of the piece-by-piece content publishers, press content publishers like Matter, they're flagging up how long articles will take to read. So again, it's just about sort of saying to people, I recognise you're going to be watching or reading this in all kinds of different situations, and I'm going to take account of that in how I serve it up to you.
We're having an interesting conversation with our colleagues in news at the moment about video formats that you use online. You know, if people are holding their screen like that, actually this idea of convergence where you can create content once and put it everywhere isn't really true. And so what does video look like in portrait size? How do you serve it in a format, as you say, when you've got 5 minutes and you can just watch them like that? And then, or crucially, how do you then integrate in a way that audiences appreciate kind of content we've been talking about today into that experience so that it feels comfortable, you know, works for audiences and obviously for the brand as well, and it is a new experience. So that will be something we're excited to be talking to people about this year, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think old school principles like message and moment go out the window when suddenly everyone's sort of heads turned by the idea of content marketing. You know, and I think it raises some interesting kind of plugins to any brief about content in terms of snackable content, length of content, written or video, short form versus long form, and that possibly the suggestion that content is absolutely liquid and can be screen agnostic and flow anywhere seamlessly is perhaps actually naive, and that it should be packaged, you know, cognizant of the context, that there's a screen hierarchy or a screen ecosystem, and what becomes interesting is how you can chop and change bits of content of length and put them together in some quite interesting non-linear ways to help build an overall content experience. You know, and then that gets into some really interesting ideas about, you know, playing with timelines versus that timelines fall out the window with content, which is.
And then if emotion still remains the trigger, how do you get to that emotion so quickly that you keep their attention? It's hard to do in 5 seconds. That's where surprise and delight and all that stuff comes in.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about targeting, actually, it's not. I'd also like to say it's not just the emotion that's inherent in the piece. You also got to think about the emotional state of the reader or the user. So, you know, we talk a lot, or a lot of what we talk about is inherent. Or it talks a lot about targeting and focused content to particular people. But increasingly, that's going to be able to be delivered in a biometric sense. You know, you not just know who I am as a person and what my demographics are and perhaps what my viewing history has been, but also, you know, what my mood is at that precise moment, sensed through my smartphone, my heartbeat monitor in my smartphone, etc., etc. I mean, that's not for now, but, you know, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you'll be serving up content in a directed way that's directed not just at who I am, but how I'm feeling and what I might want at that particular time.
That's going to throw the ad-blocking people into a tizzy. Okay. How are we doing on time? Good? All right. So let's talk about then the actual strategy behind, the larger marketing strategy behind content marketing. When you're looking at a wide advertising messaging strategy, where does content generally play in? Because when I think about the large landscape of advertising, I sort of think that traditional messaging goes wide, it goes broad. We're talking about big brand messages to a very big array of people, right? But then I also think, well, then target content marketing, and let's be clear, there's a lot of different functions for target marketing, content marketing. It goes deep. So when do you pull the lever on that particular strategy? Yeah.
That's a tough one. I mean, I think that for me, content is now just a part of the marketing mix. I don't see many campaigns now for big global campaigns where there's not some element of it involved. In terms of whether it's that or it's that, I mean, that's not where it should start. I mean, it's Simon's background as well. I mean, great communications planning should, define who your audiences are, where they are, what's their behaviours, and then the solution, if you like, the strategic and then the creative solution for that should be based on the business objectives of that brand and that particular campaign. So I think it's really about deciding what is the most efficient way to reach that audience. So, and it still could be, a 30-second spot, but you rarely see 30-second spots now when you're delivering a piece of content to such a broad audience as that might be, without underpinning that with digital content that actually extends that storytelling, moves the consumer from being aware of that brand into, at least a moment of consideration, ultimately through to purchase. I think you can't do that through traditional methods. You need to create digital assets that will enable people to go on that journey. And I think the big art to this, and I guess where I come from this is that the creative community and the advertising community, I don't think have fully yet embraced some of the learnings that come out of studies like this. And my comment was I would just urge them to do that, because there are some, as we know, in the worlds of TV and in the worlds of advertising, creativity is as good as it's ever been. But I think unless we understand consumer behaviours intimately, like we are doing in these sorts of studies, and actually also the creative language of the platforms that we need to speak to these audiences on now, because how you present content and a format on Facebook is totally different to Instagram, which is totally different to an online owned channel, to other channels. So it opens up a whole load of different dimensions, which can seem quite intimidating, I think, to a creative community. But I think once you get through that barrier, and actually intimately, most people are on those platforms anyway, so it's just about using the simple idea that comes from, and then reinterpreting it on the platforms where the audiences are in a native way to how people consume content.
I think it's just about, it's called this the science of engagement. I think it's about welcoming the science, welcoming the data, welcoming the opportunity that all this information brings us, whereas in the past, you would have very limited amount of information if you're running an advertising campaign on TV. We get 1.8 billion page views a month on bbc.com, so that's a huge amount of data telling us what kind of stories editorial stories this is that we've told have worked well, what haven't, what formats have worked well, what haven't, and stuff like this, sort of the emotional intelligence that you can get to understand how content resonates is just another way that you can, to help you decide when you're having the conversations with brands, with partners about what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve. Well, let's have a look at this. We know our audience is really interested in this. We can see the evidence there. We know that this will really emotionally resonate. We're going to expect these kind of emotions. It just helps you establish, what you're expecting to achieve, and sort of commission smart. Think smart about the kind of content you're creating. But this is all science. Ultimately, the art is the actual storytelling, is the creating, content that's engaging, hearing human stories, seeing things done in a way that leads to these emotional responses. And you can have all the science in the world, but if the storytelling isn't there at the core, if it isn't done well, then actually all the technology doesn't really help you if the heart's missing.
And I think to your question, the danger is where you're asking where does content marketing fit in. The danger is if we believe that it has to be pigeonholed as something to fit into the mix. So it starts off as, what is the insight, the audience insight? How can that be something that's a turnkey opportunity for a brand? How does that lead into a strategic idea that becomes a powerful creative idea? And then how can that be communicated? And I think we naturally pigeonhole in order to get our head around things, whether they're new things or old things. Digital, and now we're dropping that as a potential descriptor. It won't be long before we think we can stop talking about content marketing as being something different to advertising, because quite frankly, really great advertising, and there is some great advertising out there. Some Guinness Surfs being an example. Why isn't that content? It is. It's great content. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Advertising transcends itself and goes to a higher order place when it actually becomes something more than a push marketing intrusion and what to sell.
I couldn't agree more. So, and I think that the difference, because it was probably about 10 years ago when this whole debate was around digital, and for me, the difference for advertising between digital and where we are now with content is that digital kind of initially just became another channel to put your advertising on. It kind of, so you had radio, TV, outdoor, and digital initially just became another channel just to put your ad on. So I think it was just creating a new environment and a new format. And I think to your earlier point, the difference with content is that content could be advertised. What's the difference between those two things? And it's just a different format for it, isn't it?
I mean, where we're getting some murky grounds if content becomes the client meeting where we have to have the content marketing conversation.
Exactly. Or it's 10% of the budget.
Yeah, and it becomes a throwback to when everyone had to have the app meeting. We need an app. The answer isn't we need content marketing solution. It's how can we actually take a brand to a higher order place where it challenges people's preconceived ideas about what brands can deliver for people, and certainly to the generational opportunities. Younger audiences are more open-minded and broad-minded to being receptive to brands delivering something that audiences might naturally like and want, as opposed to just trying to become kind of snake oil sellers.
Okay. I think that is a good place to wrap up. My apologies if this is run a little short. It must be my 21st century attention span.
It's jet lag.
So yeah, maybe. So I think to wrap up, I think what we've learned here is that feeling something is better than feeling nothing. Feeling nothing is poison. We want our content to be brand forward when it's editorially appropriate. The brands have to have something to say. And, consumers are ready for this. They're ready for these nuanced conversations. This new generation that is coming up doesn't really know, I shouldn't say they don't know, I don't want to undersell them, but is very self-aware, but also open to the idea of content from brands. And I think that's about it. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. Now we'll open up to questions. Does anyone have?
Hi. Oh. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting us. It was very, very interesting. I have one question that is always coming from from the marketing, from our clients, because it's true our clients are looking now for producing amazing and high quality content. It's true they're also adapting the content to the platforms. It's great. But the question that we always have is that is actually this content is helping to engage with our consumers, we have more brand visibility, is actually helping me to sell more. So do we have evidence in terms of how much actually an amazing piece of content can actually contribute for selling more, I don't know, ketchup or mayo, or, it's not always about Coca-Cola.
I think that's a great question, actually, because it's something that we didn't touch upon particularly, but that you strike at the heart of, which is how does content, or indeed any point of advertising, fit in within the path to purchase or consumer journey? And if we're couching content within an online world, then suddenly, ultimately that path to purchase can be compressed to a single click. And so if you take some of the really interesting and strong work that's done by a lot of the online retailers that's producing effectively editorial and have almost crossed the divide and become like the style Bibles of Vogue. And this is kind of like, was Vogue going to become Net-a-Porter quicker than Net-a-Porter could become Vogue? And so Net-a-Porter is producing, say, and ASOS is another one, producing the kind of editorial content, the kind of magazine-style, lifestyle-based content that also showcases the products that they're selling, that allows a one-click purchase. So there are certainly certain brands and certain business models that can operate within an online space that can really converge the content and commerce question down to one click, and are doing it very well.
Right. And I would also mention that, while we're sort of talking about the landscape of, big emotive storytelling, content is very nimble and it can do a lot of things. And, a very old school form of content that marketers have been doing for decades and decades is the simple recipe cards. Well, those are now clickable. You like a recipe, you click to get the coupon. Recipes are content. We could get into a very large conversation on exactly what content is. But yeah, I think it's a matter of plotting out that path to purchase and seeing how content can actually nurture that relationship and drive people through. And that's kind of like a next level conversation that folks have to have with their clients. Anyone else? Wow. We answered all their questions, guys.
Nailed it.
High fives all around. Okay. Well, I guess that's it. Thank you so much for joining us.